I'm Alexandria, 33, female. I live in a high-rise apartment in the city, a place where the noise never truly dies, and my life moves at the speed of a 24-hour news cycle. As a political campaign manager, my job is to shape narratives and control chaos, skills I never imagined I'd have to use against my own family. My life was a carefully constructed fortress of schedules and strategies, until an inheritance I never wanted shattered it all. This is the story of how a piece of worthless land, ridiculed by my relatives, became the catalyst for unearthing a painful betrayal and delivering a justice they never saw coming. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. My father, David, was a simple man who believed in the value of things you could touch: good soil, sturdy wood, and the calloused skin on your own hands. He was a master carpenter, a man who saw potential in a raw block of oak the way others see it in a rising stock. He was also the black sheep of the Miller family. His older brother, my Uncle Richard, was the complete opposite. Richard believed in numbers on a screen, in portfolios and dividends. He was a wealth management advisor who wore tailored suits and measured a person's worth by their net assets. Their worlds were so different that they barely overlapped, except at the obligatory holiday dinners where my father's quiet contentment was always treated with a kind of pitying condescension by Richard and his family. When my father passed away after a short, aggressive illness, it felt like the world had tilted off its axis. He was my anchor, the one person whose approval I craved without condition. The grief was a physical weight. In the weeks that followed, I was just trying to keep my head above water, juggling my demanding job with the crushing logistics of loss. The last thing on my mind was his will. I assumed he had little to leave besides his workshop, his tools, and a modest savings account. He'd always told me, "Lexi, my legacy isn't in money. It's in what you build with your own two hands." The piece of land was a footnote in his life story. He had bought it decades ago, a sprawling 500-acre tract of dry, dusty plains in West Texas, a place where the horizon was a flat, unbroken line and the sky was overwhelmingly vast. He'd had a romantic dream of one day building a self-sufficient homestead, a place to escape the noise. It was a dream he never got to realize. Over the years, the land became a family punchline. At Christmas, Uncle Richard would ask with a smirk, "How's your father's dust farm, Alexandria? Struck any dirt yet?" My cousin Mark, who followed in his father's footsteps with an almost sycophantic devotion, would snicker and add, "Dad says you can't even grow weeds out there." To them, the land was a symbol of my father's foolishness, his failure to embrace their world of shrewd investments. They saw it as a liability, an annual property tax bill for a patch of useless earth. I had only been there once as a child. I remembered the biting wind, the thorny scrub brush, and the feeling of being incredibly small. It wasn't a place of happy memories, but it was his. It was the physical manifestation of his unfulfilled dream, and for that reason alone, I couldn't bear the thought of letting it go, no matter how impractical it was. The property was an emotional anchor, a connection to the man I had just lost. Little did I know, it was also a time bomb, ticking silently in the background of our family's strained relationship, waiting for the right moment to explode. The deed was tucked away in my father's old desk, a piece of paper representing a forgotten dream and a future I could never have anticipated. The will reading was held in a sterile, impersonal conference room at the office of my father's estate lawyer. The air was thick with a cloying floral sent from a sympathy bouquet that my aunt had sent, a gesture that felt more obligatory than sincere. I sat on one side of the polished mahogany table, and on the other sat Uncle Richard, my Aunt Carol, and their son, Mark. Richard looked impatient, constantly checking the gold watch on his wrist as if he had far more important places to be. Mark was busy scrolling on his phone, a smug look plastered on his face. The lawyer, a kind, elderly man named Mr. Peterson, read through the will with a gentle solemnity. It was straightforward. My father's savings, his truck, and his personal effects were all left to me. The workshop and his tools were to be appraised and sold, with the proceeds also going to me. It was all predictable, all modest. I saw Richard relax slightly, a subtle release of tension in his shoulders. He probably thought the whole affair was a waste of his valuable time. Then Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. And finally, he said, adjusting his glasses to his only daughter, Alexandria Miller, "David leaves his sole real estate property, the 500-acre parcel of land in Midland County, Texas." A quiet snort came from across the table. It was Mark. He quickly tried to cover it with a cough, but the damage was done. Uncle Richard didn't even bother to hide his disdain. He leaned forward, placing his manicured hands on the table. "Mr. Peterson," he began, his voice dripping with false concern, "is there any provision for the sale of that property? Frankly, it's a burden. The property taxes alone are a needless expense for Alexandria to take on. As her uncle, and as a financial advisor, I'd strongly recommend she liquidate that liability immediately. In fact, my firm could handle the sale, find some rancher who might want it for grazing, and save her the headache." He was framing it as a favor, a benevolent act of familial duty, but I knew my uncle. Every offer he made came with strings attached, usually woven into a net designed to benefit him. "I'm not selling it," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Richard's smile tightened. "Alexandria, don't be sentimental. Your father was a wonderful man, but he was not a savvy investor. That land is a money pit. It has no water rights, no mineral rights of any note, and frankly, it's in the middle of nowhere. It's worthless. It was my father's." I replied, the words feeling inadequate. "It was his dream. It's not for sale." Mark chimed in, his tone mocking. "A dream of what, exactly? Watching tumbleweeds? Come on, Alex, Dad's right. Take the cash, whatever little you can get for it, and invest it in something that actually generates a return. Don't make the same mistake he did." The insult to my father, so casual and cruel, felt like a slap in the face. They weren't just talking about a piece of land. They were passing judgment on my father's entire life, on his values, on everything that made him different from them. They saw his legacy as a failure to be corrected. The meeting ended shortly after. As we were leaving, I overheard Richard muttering to Mark in the hallway, his voice a low, conspiratorial rumble. "She's just as naive as he was. Let her hold on to her precious empty land. She'll come crawling to us when the tax bills pile up. It's a lesson she needs to learn herself." Their laughter echoed down the marble hallway as they walked away. It wasn't joyful laughter. It was cold, sharp, and dismissive. It was the sound of people who believed they had one, who saw my grief and my loyalty to my father as a weakness to be exploited. I stood there, clutching the folder containing the deed to my father's worthless land, and a new feeling began to bloom amidst the grief, a cold, hard knot of anger. They had laughed at my father in life, and now they were laughing at his memory. They thought I was naive. They thought I was weak. It was then that I decided I would prove them wrong. I didn't know how, but I would protect the one piece of his dream he had left behind. The first property tax bill arrived a few months later, a stark reminder of my uncle's warning. It wasn't astronomical, but it was an expense I hadn't budgeted for. As I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the official-looking envelope, Richard's condescending voice echoed in my head, "She'll come crawling to us." I crumpled the notice in my fist. Not a chance. I would pay it. I would pay it every year if I had to. But his words had planted a seed of doubt. Was he right? Was I just being sentimental about a financially draining piece of dirt? I decided I needed to know exactly what I was holding on to. I couldn't rely on the biased assessment of my uncle. I needed an expert, someone I could trust. My mind immediately went to Samuel Jones. Sam was a retired land surveyor who had been one of my father's oldest and dearest friends. They had met in their 20s and bonded over a shared love for the outdoors and a healthy skepticism of city life. Sam was a man of integrity, as solid and dependable as the earth he spent his life measuring. He had delivered a heartfelt eulogy at my father's funeral, speaking of his quiet strength and unwavering character. I found his number in my dad's old address book and called him, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and anxiety. I explained the situation, how my uncle was pressuring me to sell, and how he had dismissed the land as utterly worthless. Sam was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with a strange sort of caution. "Your father loved that land, Lexi," he said slowly. "He talked about it all the time. He never thought it was worthless. But is it?" I pressed. "From a practical standpoint, Uncle Richard said it has no water rights, no mineral rights. The mineral rights part is interesting." Sam interrupted. "When your dad bought that land 30 years ago, the mineral rights were severed from the surface rights. That's common in Texas. The original seller kept them, but your dad was persistent. He spent years tracking down the descendants of that family, who were scattered all over the country. About 10 years ago, he finally managed to buy them all back for a song. Nobody thought they were worth anything. My breath caught in my throat. He owned the mineral rights. He sure did," Sam confirmed. He filed the deed himself at the Midland County Courthouse. He was so proud of that. He said he wanted to own the land from the sky all the way down to the center of the earth. Your Uncle Richard is either lying or he's ignorant. Knowing him, I'd bet on the former. This was a bombshell. My uncle, a wealth management advisor, had explicitly stated the land had no significant mineral rights. It was a lie, a calculated one designed to make me feel helpless and force me to sell. Sam, I said, my mind racing. Would you be willing to take a look at it for me? I'll cover all your expenses, I need to know what's really there. I'd be honored to, Lexi, for your father, he replied without hesitation. A week later, Sam drove out to the property. He spent 2 full days there, walking the entire perimeter, taking soil samples, and using equipment I didn't understand. He called me on the evening of the 2nd day. Lexi, he began, and I could hear the excitement in his voice, a crackle of energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. You need to sit down. I sank into a chair. What is it, Sam? I'm not a geologist, mind you. He said, but I've been surveying this state for 45 years. I know what to look for. There are geological formations out here, shales. They look very, very promising. The kind of formations that oil companies are spending billions on just a few counties over. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Your father's worthless land, Lexi. It's sitting right on top of what looks like a geological sweet spot. A very sweet spot. He didn't just buy back the mineral rights. He bought a lottery ticket. I think it's time you found out if you've won. My mind spun. Oil. The word seemed absurd, like something out of a movie. The family joke, the dust farm. The symbol of my father's supposed failure could be a source of unimaginable wealth. The secret wasn't just that the land had potential. It was that my father had known it, or at least suspected it. He had quietly and methodically secured the mineral rights, playing the long game while my uncle preached about quick returns. He had left me more than a dream. He had left me a legacy of quiet wisdom and foresight. And my uncle had tried to trick me out of it for pennies on the dollar. The anger I felt before now had a sharp, cutting edge. This was no longer just about protecting my father's memory. It was about exposing a liar. Sam's revelation changed everything. The game had shifted, and I was no longer just a grieving daughter holding onto a sentimental piece of property. I was now the guardian of a potentially massive asset, and more importantly, the target of a calculated deception by my own family. My work as a campaign manager had taught me one crucial lesson: never go into a fight without solid intelligence. Emotion would get me nowhere. I needed facts, I needed proof. My first move was to hire a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but the best one I could find. I researched top attorneys in Texas specializing in mineral rights and oil and gas law. That's how I found Jessica Chen. She was a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer in her 40s with a reputation for being a shark in the courtroom. During our first consultation, I laid out the whole story: my father's land, my uncle's dismissal of its value, his explicit lie about the mineral rights, and Sam's preliminary findings. Jessica listened intently, her face impassive. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. Your uncle isn't a stupid man, Alexandria, she said, her voice crisp. A wealth advisor would know how to check county records for mineral rights. If he told you they didn't exist, it wasn't a mistake. It was a lie. The question is, why? Was he just trying to get you to sell cheap to some random rancher, or did he have his own buyer lined up? That question hung in the air, sinister and unsettling. The thought that Richard might have been actively working to acquire the land himself had never occurred to me. It was a new level of betrayal. Jessica recommended the next steps. First, we needed a full geological survey and a resource assessment from a reputable firm to confirm Sam's suspicions and determine the potential value of the reserves. Second, we needed to investigate my uncle. I have a private investigator I work with, Jessica said, scribbling a name on a notepad. He's discreet and incredibly thorough. Let's see what Mr. Richard Miller has been up to. See if he's had any recent communications with oil exploration companies or land acquisition agents. The geological survey was expensive, but I saw it as an investment in the truth. I paid for it out of my father's savings, feeling like I was using his hard-earned money to protect his legacy. The 2 weeks I spent waiting for the results were agonizing. I barely slept, my mind a whirlwind of possibilities. The report came back on a Tuesday. I remember my hands shaking as I opened the encrypted email from the geology firm. The document was dense, filled with seismic data, core sample analyses, and technical jargon. But the summary on the first page was all I needed to see. The firm estimated the recoverable oil reserves beneath my father's land, my land, to be in the tens of millions of barrels. The potential value was staggering, a number with so many zeros it looked fake. Sam hadn't just found a sweet spot, he'd found a jackpot. The very next day, the private investigator called Jessica. The information he'd uncovered was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. He had found a trail of emails between my Uncle Richard and a land acquisition agent for a major oil corporation. The emails had started just 3 days after my father's death. Richard had initiated the contact. He described a naive niece who had just inherited a worthless parcel that he could convince her to sell for a pittance. He was negotiating a finder's fee for himself and a quick, low-ball sale price for the land, contingent on him getting me to sign the papers. He was planning to buy it from me for next to nothing, perhaps under the guise of a shell company, and then immediately flip it to the oil company for a fortune. Reading the printouts of those emails in Jessica's office felt like a physical blow. The cold, clinical way he discussed my sentimentality and financial ignorance was sickening. My cousin Mark was copied on several of the emails, adding his own smug comments about how I would fold under pressure. They weren't just laughing at me behind my back. They were actively plotting to steal my inheritance, using my grief as a tool to manipulate me. The foundation of our family, already cracked and strained, had just crumbled into dust. There was no misunderstanding, no gray area. This was a deliberate, malicious act of betrayal. Jessica looked at me, her expression a mixture of professional calm and human sympathy. "So, Alexandria," she said, her voice steady, "we have the geological report, and we have the proof of their conspiracy. The question is no longer what the land is worth. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" In that moment, the grief and confusion I had been feeling for months finally solidified into something else entirely, pure, cold resolve. I was a campaign manager. I knew how to run a campaign, and I was about to launch the most personal and devastating one of my entire career. My Uncle Richard's world was built on a carefully crafted image of success, integrity, and community leadership. He was a prominent member of the city's financial elite, a man who sat on the board of several high-profile charities and whose name was often mentioned in the society pages. His reputation was his most valuable asset, more precious than any stock in his portfolio. I knew that a quiet legal victory, while satisfying, wouldn't be enough. He had tried to humiliate me and dishonor my father's memory in the shadows. I was going to expose him in the brightest light possible. I wasn't just going to win. I was going to dismantle the false persona he had spent a lifetime building. My conversation with Jessica Chen shifted from legal strategy to public relations warfare. "I don't want to just sue him," I explained, the words tasting like ice. "I want to create a situation where his greed is laid bare for everyone to see. I want him to be the author of his own downfall." A slow smile spread across Jessica's face. "I like the way you think, Alexandria, a public reckoning." Our plan had 2 parallel tracks, the legal and the public. On the legal side, Jessica began preparing the necessary paperwork to officially lease the mineral rights. She reached out to several major oil companies, all except the one Richard had been colluding with, and initiated a private, competitive bidding process. The offers that started rolling in were astronomical, confirming the initial report and then some. We were careful to keep this entire process under a strict non-disclosure agreement. As far as the world knew, the land was still just a dusty, forgotten acreage. On the public front, I began my campaign. My target was the annual Heart of the City Charity Gala, the premier philanthropic event of the year. Uncle Richard was the chairman of the gala's organizing committee. It was his crowning social achievement, an event where he could swan around, shaking hands with the city's most powerful people, basking in their admiration. This year, the gala was raising funds to build a new pediatric wing for the main hospital. It was the perfect stage. My first step was to secure my own place at the event. I made a significant donation to the hospital, enough to get a table right at the front. I did it anonymously at first, using a shell entity Jessica helped me set up. Then, I began to plant the seeds. I used my political contacts to drop hints to a few friendly journalists about a major feel-good philanthropic announcement, expected at the gala from a surprise new donor. I framed it as a human interest story, a mysterious benefactor set to make a huge splash. The media, always hungry for a positive story, took the bait. Buzz began to build around the event. Next, I worked with Jessica to draft a press release. It was a masterpiece of carefully worded narrative. It would announce the establishment of the David Miller Memorial Foundation, a new charity dedicated to funding vocational training scholarships for underprivileged youth, a cause my carpenter father would have cherished. The release would state that the foundation was being funded by an initial endowment created from the lease of mineral rights on a piece of land in West Texas that David Miller had purchased and held onto for 30 years. It would detail the size of the endowment, a staggering 8, figure number that would make jaws drop. The final piece of the plan was the timing. I wanted Richard to walk directly into the trap, blind and arrogant. 2 days before the gala, I sent a simple, carefully worded email to both him and Mark. Subject, the Texas property uncle Richard. Mark, after much consideration, I've decided you were right. Holding on to that empty land is too much of a sentimental and financial burden for me. I've decided to sell. I know you mentioned you might be able to help handle the sale, and I would be grateful for your expertise. Perhaps we can discuss it soon. Best, Alexandria, the bait was set. I imagine the triumphant, greedy smiles on their faces as they read my email. They would think I had finally come to my senses. They would believe their manipulative plan had worked perfectly, and that I was crawling back to them, just as they had predicted. They would be walking into that gala feeling smug, victorious, and utterly clueless, ready to celebrate their success among their peers. They had no idea they weren't walking into a celebration. They were walking onto a stage I had built just for them, and the final act was about to begin. The ballroom was a sea of glittering chandeliers, designer gowns, and tuxedos. The air buzzed with the low hum of polite conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. From my table near the stage, I had a perfect view of the entire room. I watched as my Uncle Richard moved through the crowd, radiating smug self-importance. He clapped men on the back, kissed women on the cheek, and accepted compliments on the event's success with a practiced, humble smile. Mark trailed behind him, a pale imitation of his father's arrogance. When Richard spotted me, he made his way over, his expression a perfect blend of feigned sympathy and triumph. "Alexandria, my dear," he said, placing a condescending hand on my shoulder. "I'm so glad you could make it, and I was so pleased to receive your email. You've made a very wise decision. We'll take care of everything for you, don't you worry." "Thank you, Uncle," I said, my voice steady and my smile as artificial as his. "I appreciate it more than you know." He gave my shoulder a final pat and moved on, completely oblivious. He saw me as a problem that had been solved, a loose end now neatly tied up. He couldn't have been more wrong. The evening progressed with dinner and a silent auction. Finally, it was time for the main event, Richard's speech as the gala chairman. He took the stage to thunderous applause. He spoke eloquently about community, about giving back, about the responsibility of the privileged to help the less fortunate. He was captivating. He was a fraud. It is in this spirit of generosity, he concluded, his voice ringing with false sincerity, that we build a better future for our city. As the applause died down, the event's MC returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "we have one final, very special announcement tonight. It seems our community has a new major philanthropist in its midst. We were informed just this afternoon of a truly breathtaking inaugural donation to launch a new charitable endeavor. Please direct your attention to the screens." The large screens on either side of the stage, which had been displaying the gala's logo, flickered to life. A beautifully designed graphic appeared, featuring a picture of my father, smiling, in his workshop. The text read, introducing the David Miller Memorial Foundation. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. I saw Richard's smile falter. He shot a puzzled look at the event organizers, who simply shrugged. The MC continued, her voice filled with excitement. "The David Miller Memorial Foundation, established in honor of the late master carpenter David Miller, will provide vocational scholarships to help young people build their own futures, and I am thrilled to announce that the foundation is being launched with an initial endowment of $50 million. A collective gasp went through the room. The amount was stunning. Then the next slide appeared. It was a map of Texas with a 500-acre plot in Midland County highlighted in gold. The text read, "Funded by the legacy David Miller believed in, the successful lease of mineral rights on his empty land." I finally looked directly at my uncle. The color had drained from his face. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide with dawning horror. He looked from the screen to me, and for the first time, he saw me not as his naive niece, but as the architect of his public execution. Just as the shock was setting in, every phone in the room buzzed almost in unison. On my cue, Jessica's firm had sent out the press release to the entire event guest list and every major news outlet in the state. Attached to that press release were two things: the geological survey summary highlighting the land's immense value, and the complete, unredacted email chain between Richard Miller, Mark Miller, and the oil company's land agent. The low murmur in the room turned into a cacophony of frantic whispers. People were no longer looking at the stage. They were looking at their phones, then up at Richard, their expressions shifting from admiration to shock and disgust. They were reading his words, his plan to defraud his grieving niece, his mockery of his own brother's memory. They were seeing the man behind the carefully constructed facade. He was exposed, his reputation stripped away in a matter of seconds in front of the very people whose respect he valued most. Mark looked like he was going to be physically sick. I rose from my table and walked toward my uncle, who was still standing on the stage, paralyzed. I didn't say a word. I just met his gaze with a look of cold, quiet finality. In my eyes, he saw the full extent of his miscalculation. He hadn't just underestimated the land. He had underestimated my father. And most of all, he had underestimated me. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Richard and Mark. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. "City philanthropist exposed in family fraud scheme" was the headline of the leading newspaper. The story had everything: greed, betrayal, family drama, and a satisfying, karmic twist. The emails were the smoking gun. Their own words convicted them. Richard was forced to resign from the charity board in disgrace. Several of his high-net worth clients, horrified by his duplicity, pulled their accounts from his firm. The company he had built his life around began to hemorrhage money and credibility. The last I heard, he and my aunt had sold their lavish home and moved to a smaller town to escape the public shame. Mark was fired from his brokerage firm, which couldn't distance itself from him fast enough. His reputation in the financial industry was irrevocably destroyed. They had craved wealth and status above all else, and in their attempt to steal mine, they lost both. I never spoke to them again. There was nothing left to say. My life, however, changed in ways I could never have imagined. The David Miller Memorial Foundation became my new passion. I stepped back from the high-stress world of political campaigns and took on the role of executive director of the foundation myself. It felt like I was finally doing the work I was meant to do, honoring my father not just by protecting his legacy, but by building upon it. We awarded our first round of scholarships that fall. I met the recipients, aspiring electricians, welders, plumbers, and mechanics. They were bright, hardworking young people who, like my father, believed in the power of creating something real with their own hands. Seeing their hope and determination, I knew my father would have been proud. I kept the land. I never set foot on it again, but I didn't need to. It was no longer a place of dusty memories, but a symbol of quiet strength and hidden potential. The oil wells, operated by the leasing company, are discreet, pumping away and funding countless dreams. Sometimes I look at the quarterly statements from the foundation, at the numbers that still seem unreal, and I think of my uncle's mocking words, "You can't even grow weeds out there." He was wrong. My father and I, we grew something far more valuable. We grew justice, we grew opportunity, we grew a new legacy, one sown from the seeds of betrayal but harvested in the spirit of a simple carpenter who always knew the true value of things.